So without further ado, I'll pass it on to him.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to be talking about something that you all have already done a lot of, or you're going to be doing a lot of, which is building decks, presenting. So just by show of hands, has anybody done a presentation or this sort of presentation at least, whether in your graduate degree or outside in business? Just put up your hand if you've ever done a presentation, basically. Which is everyone. That's pretty much what I was expecting. So to give a great presentation, there are certain guidelines and structures that we can follow that allows us to deliver our message. Basically, everyone in this room is capable of becoming the next best consultant or whatever you're going into. Everyone in here is capable of changing the world in essence, in a way, because we're all able to essentially create ideas. We all have ideas. We have ideas on how to improve operations. We have ideas on how to improve profit. And these ideas can be great and change industries, but to convey these ideas, you need to be able to communicate them. And to communicate the ideas, you need to be able to convey or persuade your idea to the audience. I'm sure a lot of you have gone through case competitions and your team might have gone second, might have came second. And you're thinking to yourself, you're watching the final presentation and they're the winners. And you're thinking to yourself, crap, my idea was better than these guys. Why didn't we win? And honestly, a lot of times great ideas don't get implemented because they weren't communicated effectively. So to communicate ideas effectively, you can communicate that through telling a story. By telling a story, you can get their buy-ins a lot easier. It's a lot more structured. You can essentially, people have an emotional reaction to stories. They feel stories as opposed to someone coming up and giving you a ton of information and it's all monotonous and you don't care. But if you tell them a story, something that follows a structure, something that has some sort of guidelines, then you can really convey your ideas and you can communicate them effectively and win case competitions if you're all doing that next week. So this is going into drama and into, if anyone's ever taken an English course, you might know Freytag's pyramid. And essentially he's a 18th century storyteller or novelist, playwright. And he argued that every story has 5 acts. You have your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then denouement. And although we're going to be talking about stories, it's good to know this sort of structure because it allows you to structure your ideas in ways that might not exactly fall into these 5 acts for a story that is business story and contains a lot of data. But it does follow similar pattern to these stories. So it's good to know structures, good to know pyramids about how to tell a story, how to convey ideas. And one of those structures or stories that is used quite often in consulting is called the pyramid principle. And this was coined, or the concept came up with Barbara Minto, who was an who was a McKinsey, who worked at McKinsey, or she was a McKinsey consultant, and she came up with this concept. And it's a pretty hard concept to try to understand altogether, but I've kind of narrowed it down. And she argued that if you use a pyramid principle, you can make the reader to grasp your ideas. It allows you to organize your ideas, and it makes the reader to grasp your ideas and understand and follow your logic through your ideas. It basically simplifies it in a way to convey your idea, basically. And I'm just dumbed it down. It's much more complicated than what I have here, but essentially the pyramid is, and it's something I'm sure a lot of you have heard before, maybe. And I encourage you to go look it up and read a lot more about it. But essentially, you start out with your answer to the problem. And then you break that down into a summary of supporting arguments that essentially encompass or that are part of the answer. And then you break those down even further to the logic order of your arguments. So then it's like a high answer, it's a very high level answer, and then you're essentially breaking it down into bite-sized information where your reader can follow your logic. And that's the key or the structure that most of the consulting decks are basically designed. You give your recommendation up front, and then you go through the logic of why your recommendation is the one they should follow, basically. So it's not quite like the Freytag's pyramid, but it is a structure that we can live by, that we can use to tell stories, our stories, the stories that change industries, that allow us to convey why they should, do your recommendation, basically. So to write this story, you start with your introduction, like just introduce the problem. What's the problem? Here is why the client hired you, for instance. So this is the problem, like reduced profit, and you're here to solve that, or anything, basically. And then you apply the pyramid principle to basically your answer, and you create a storyboard based on your pyramid. So if you break down your answer in this pyramid, then you can use those as tools to create a storyboard. And once you have your storyboard, it's a lot easier to create your slides at that point. So this way, you're much more organized. You start with your pyramid, create a storyboard, and then generate your slides. And then you modify those slides day and night, because that's what consultants do. Nobody ever sits down and say, oh, Greg, I'm so glad I'm done. Consultants are very meticulous about their slide designs. So we should be too, actually. So basically, you create your pyramid by starting with the answer right at the top. Don't use too many subcategories in your pyramid. Ideally, you want to use 3 subcategories for each category. So I have here, you have your answer at the top, then you have 3 subcategories of your arguments or the summary of arguments, and then each argument breaks down into further 3 subcategories. So basically, you got your introduction to the problem, then you insert your answer to the pyramid, then you have your summary of argument 1, 2, and 3, and then under those you got argument 1.1, 1.2, and you kind of want to follow the logic vertically here. So your answer's at the top, and you're vertically following the logic down through to your bottom level subcategories. But that's basically, by doing that, you're answering the whys and the hows of your answer. And of course, this I'm sure has been ingrained in you by now. You want to keep your subcategories MECES, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So you want each subcategory to stand on its own, and you want all of the subcategories to cover all of the principles, all the ideas that you want to cover in your deck. So here's an example, for instance. So how can the company A reduce their cost by 10%? And so your answer, right off the bat, you've done your analysis, you have your answer. Your answer is right up at the top. The cost can be reduced by 5 million through operational improvements. And now you break that down, literally, you break it down to 3 million by outsourcing your non-core functions, 1 million by simply just simplifying core functions, and then another 1 million you can save by reviewing the supplier cost and maybe renegotiating that. So now you have 3 exclusively, they're basically MECES at this point. So you go one step further. Now you're breaking down the first problem. For instance, you're writing let's look at non-cores. So you're suggesting to your client that you want to select some non-core functions. So identify and select these non-core functions. What are they? And then once you have identified those, evaluate the costs and the service levels of potential partners that you can outsource these to. And then finally, choose the partners that make the most sense so you can save money. So that's covering that first parent or first argument. And then so on and so forth, right? So the second one is simplify core functions. So you can do this by designing current processes, compare those to best practices in the business or benchmarks in the industry, and then adopt the best practices that are based on those benchmarks, basically. And the last one, again, I'm not going to go through it, but you kind of get the idea. So the idea is to break down this huge answer at the top, save $5 million, but how do you do that? So you break it down. So we talked about vertical integration, but there is, and I'm sure you've noticed by now, at the bottom level, it's actually there is horizontal integration or horizontal logic. And you can use that both vertical and horizontal when you're creating this pyramid. So that's fantastic. You have your pyramid, you've created it, and you've applied vertical and horizontal logic. Now you use that pyramid to create a storyboard. And you can go back to the pyramid, and essentially you've done most of your story work through this pyramid. You can like get an idea of, okay, so slide number 1, it's going to be introduction to the problem. Slide number 2, it's going to be my recommendation, my big picture recommendation, and so on and so forth. You can go through the pyramid and kind of design your storyboard using this pyramid. And then you create your storyboard, you kind of get an idea of vertical integration and horizontal integration. So the storyboard, so slide number 1, company X profit is declining. And essentially, you can design your storyboard using that pyramid. So now you integrated vertical logic, which is like, for instance, on slide number 1, company X's profit is declining. And then you're vertically showing that through that data, the graph that you have, the key message, you're reiterating it, why company X or you're just showing that company X's profits decline profits. And then you also have horizontal. You should also keep in mind and make sure your slides flow, essentially. So slide 1, profits declining. Slide 2, we should outsource. And slide 3, these are the non-core functions that we need to outsource. You can see the logic in the horizontal integration, the horizontal logic. So it's not like slide 1, profits are declining. Slide 2, let's talk about company X or company Y. Sorry, they're not related. So you want to keep them flowing and related. And here's a great example of that. This is a McKinsey deck that I pulled out of the internet. And basically, you can read the titles. Just by reading the titles, you can see the horizontal integration in their slide decks. So title number 1 is USPS is experiencing unprecedented losses. Title number 2, losses have been driven by volume declines. Next slide, volume declines have been worse than expected. Next slide, the recession has exacerbated these volume declines. You can see how each one flows. And without even looking at the content of these slides, you kind of have an idea of what the story is here, what's going on, where they're leading us, basically. So that's really important. So once you do all of this, you've got your storyboard, you've organized your thoughts, you've applied the pyramid principle. Now you can basically produce your slides. So that's kind of the path that most consultants go through when they're building their decks. And it allows you to remain structured and remain on point. So you're not talking about a million things without having a point. So to summarize this section, you write an introduction containing the situation. So like define the problem and why you were hired in the first place. What are you here to do, basically? One good, and a lot of people do, and this depends on time and whether you can do this in the given time slot or how much time you have. It's good to kind of create this current state versus future state. So here's the problem, here's the current state. This is why the current state sucks, basically. And here's why my recommendation is gonna put us up here in the future state. And this sort of current state versus future state, it's used all over the industry. When, for instance, like when Steve Jobs was introducing the iPhone in 2007, he constantly did this. He constantly showed why we need the iPhone, and he showed why the current state sucks, and he showed how much the iPhone can make that better. And it's constant oscillations between current state and future state that you kind of draw this huge contrast that allows you to really convey your idea and allows you to basically create an unmet need that you need to fill, a gap that you need to fill. So anyway, you create your Mises pyramid and you answer those supporting arguments. Then you create your logic storyboard based on your pyramid. And then through that, you generate your slides, making sure everything flows, making sure it's all nice. So now that you have your slides, you know your content, and now it comes down to making sure the style is, you have to be extremely meticulous about your slides, making sure the style and format flows as well. You have to use certain tricks or certain methods to try to convey your idea, obviously. And I'm going to go through some examples, but obviously these are not the only examples, but you should definitely think about this once you've created your slides. You should think about the style and make sure everything flows. All your fonts are the same. These little details is what a lot of people in the business world care about. I come from academia, and a lot of times what I put on the slide, it's months and months of research, and most academics don't really care that much about the design. I mean, they care, but they care much more about the results, the data on the slide. And even though data is extremely important, but in the business world, you want to have a polished style or a polished slide deck, essentially. And that it kind of shows your audience that this is the type of person you are, this is how meticulous you are, this is the type of work they should expect from you. So breaking down the management consulting slide, this is again one example. It doesn't have to stick to this all the time, but it's good to know the anatomy of the slides that are used a lot in the business. So you have margins all around, you're making sure everything lines up. You usually have your headline or title. So titles are usually just summaries of or the topic that we're going to be talking about. And then underneath the titles are usually these leaders or title leads or strap lines. And those kind of summarize the key message or the takeaway from this slide. So, and then after that, you usually have some data on one side of the slide and you kind of explain the data on the other side. So the main is the story box. The body of the slide is the story box, really. And then usually, but not always, you can have a kicker at the end that kind of reiterates your main message. And yeah, so basically emphasizes what the take-home message is from this slide. You can also put your logo, page number. So there's been a lot of research done in sort of what kind of slides grab people's attention. And some of the pointers to kind of think about when you're designing your decks is to, I didn't do a great job of it here, but it's usually good that you start with an agenda at the start of your deck. You kind of give the audience what to expect. You have visual cues to highlight the deck organization so we know where we are and how much more we got going. So I didn't do a good job of it here, but that is generally has been shown that it engages people. It gets more out of your slide if you do that. So the second and the most important is to try to reduce the amount of information you put on your slides. A lot of people they love to put a ton of information. You know, you've done the work, you want to present the work, so you put all of it on a slide, and it's just too much. People can't digest it all. So studies have shown you try to limit your message to 3 messages on each slide. I would say just bring it down to even 1 message. So rather than text, try to use visual cues. That seems to help a lot more. So instead of having a huge, like this example here on the left, there's a ton of text, but then you can break it down, even though the information's the same on the right, but now there's a lot more visual cues for your eyes to follow. And don't do dazzle or crazy formatting. I would say avoid animation. Actually, one time I was at a keynote speaker. There was a keynote speaker coming in and giving a huge speech on, or a huge talk on, this brand new drug that he discovered, and we were all my colleagues and I were sitting there, we're watching, and every slide he had an animation where it flipped to the next slide. It was the most annoying thing ever. And at the end of it, even though this guy was renowned, at the end of it, everyone, all they could talk about is those animations. So avoid animations. I mean, nobody even remembered the guy's data. We're all like, oh, did you see those animations? Hell yeah, those were crazy. That was entertaining, but for the wrong reasons. So yeah, avoid animations or dazzle. So the other huge aspect of designing slides or style is to be mindful of what kind of information you're presenting. So design meaningful analysis, essentially. So when you're generating data, design meaningful analysis and choose the right way of effective way of visualizing that data, whether it's a pie graph, a bar graph. Make sure you choose the right method of visualizing that data that you want to convey. And obviously, every slide should emphasize a message. What do you want people to take away from that slide? Try to highlight, try to bring their focus to your key message on each slide. So for instance, we have here a slide deck or a slide, and it's about company sales. You can see a graph on the left. It shows the sales from January to June in millions. And then on the right, we got some key highlights about the sales, blah, blah, blah. So here, what's the take-home message? You're not really sure unless I tell you. We can help this slide by, first of all, adding some titles and some leads. So improved marketing can increase company sales by 50%. And here's a graph showing that the new marketing campaign has increased sales by 100%. It's still not great because you're still unsure of where to look in that graph. So we can highlight that by just adding the bars that I want you to look at. So now you can see what I'm referring to. You can even put a box or even some quantification numbers on top of this. There's different ways to draw attention to get the reader to kind of look at the slide and take away the message within 30 seconds or less. And that's kind of what you want to hit on. Okay. What's the difference between these slides? Nothing. Another example is when you're dealing with tables. So this was a recent engagement that I did actually with the team. Some of you might be in here, I'm not sure. And it's a great slide. So we had 3 initiatives that we wanted our client to consider. And so we generated this table to kind of convey to them the impact that these initiatives would have. And the impact was broken down into value generation, viability, and financial cost. But right now, even though we have some pretty ways of quantifying that where it's not too complicated, that's great. You don't know what I'm trying to, you don't know where your eyes should be drawn to. Am I trying to tell you that you should choose one of the 3 initiatives? So are we comparing the first initiative to the second initiative? If that's the case, you can just add a simple visual cue by adding horizontal lines. Now your eyes are drawn to a horizontal way of looking at the data. So now you're thinking, oh, the first initiative versus the second initiative has a different value generation, for instance. But that wasn't the message that we wanted to convey because these initiatives were all mutually exclusive, sorry. So we wanted them to initiate all 3. So the way that we presented the data is by adding vertical lines. So now you're not comparing initiatives together. Now your eyes are drawn to looking at each initiative on its own and then looking at the different impact types and what they generate. And you can even go one step further and kind of highlight the exact initiative you want them to focus on. So these are just simple, easy ways to draw attention, to convey your message right away, and to create a slide that allows you to be very, very efficient at talking about what you want to, or efficient at what you want the audience to take away. Finally, obviously, there's the whole presentation style. Everyone has a different style of presenting. If you know your material very well, you might come up here and you start talking, you're talking super fast. One of the main things that I have found over the years of many, many presentations that I've done is to try to, and even though I don't do it very well myself, but try to remain self-aware during the presentation. And I've seen a lot of people make this mistake. They have practiced the presentation time and time again, but then they come up here and they're speaking so fast that no one can even pay attention to what they're saying because they're not self-aware of the speed they're talking, or they come up here and they're shuffling. You know, they don't know what to do with their hands, so they put it in their pocket. And those are usually things you want to be aware of. Just think about how you come across when you're up there. Take like 5 seconds when you stand in front of an audience just to take a breath and just before you start, just think about what you want to say. So one time actually, one of my friends was giving the very first presentation he's ever given. And he was a master's student, and he goes up in front of the audience, and at the same time, he just like loses it. He looks at the audience and he says, "Oh shit." And he just sits down and he has no idea what to say. He completely freezes. And everyone laughs, and then he gets up and at that point, he just like had a self-awareness like realization. And he's like, "I'm sorry, I gotta start this all over again." And they're like, "Fine, do it." And then he knew exactly where he was. He wasn't nervous anymore, and he just went through it. So yeah, I recommend just hearing yourself up here at the start really helps you get into the flow of it. Stay organized, and you can do that through your slide design and slide deck. I usually recommend to people put little cues on your slide, like little words that you want to make sure you hit on. Because if you make it too wordy, no one likes that. So you put little keywords on your slide, and when you look at that keyword, you'll know exactly what to say because you've practiced it. So it's good to have that little organization in mind when you're presenting. Just you look at your slide. Sometimes you even forget what the next slide is, for instance, but then you look up, you're like, okay, I see that keyword. I put that there as like a clue for myself to know exactly what to talk about. That helps a lot, actually. So every time you make a slide deck, every single slide should pass the so what question. You got to make sure what you're putting in your deck is relevant and it adds to it. If you've done a ton of awesome work and you just want to show that awesome work, but it doesn't really add to the story, who cares? Take it out. That's not an easy thing to do, but take it out. Put it in the appendices. Hopefully someone will ask you a question about it. So make sure you ask yourself, so what? What is the point of this slide? Don't overcomplicate your charts or slides. That always loses people when you have too many things. And try to always find a simple way to convey your message. Before you get into the presentation, this is so cliche, but I'm sure you all know this, practice out loud. It helps. It really helps. And adopt your own style, whatever works for you. Just make sure you're confident, you know it, and you've practiced it with your peers, out loud, by yourself, whatever. And finally, I'm gonna add this, and this is a bit of a cop-out on my end, but like, go beyond the obvious. This is very important in consulting. It's what separates the good from the great. If you can show that you've thought about even more points than what you were asked to do, like have a slide that say, if given more time, I would have covered X, Y, and Z, but right now we stayed focused on the task at hand, but we should go beyond and add a little bit more and say, and suggest to the company, so I know we solved problem X for you, but you should consider these other areas and do these sort of analysis, and essentially this is what gets you more clients. If you go beyond and show them a little bit more than they asked you to show. Yeah, and with that, I'm gonna leave it there and open the floor to any questions that you might have. Yeah.
So in the consulting industry, what would you say is the standard or balance between showing the data or the information on the slide versus just showing the web, but like saying it?
Yeah.
Like where could you put your focus? Where you just putting things on the slide so the client can look at it clear, or really just on your content as you present?
So there's different ways of approaching that. So we did a small engagement recently, and our slides were heavy, were full of information. And the main reason for that was because that deck was actually our deliverable. So at the end of it, that's the information we gave them, and they took that back to their board members and whatnot. But as a rule of thumb, I would say try to. I know Steve Jobs is amazing, and he has this quote up there: "People who use PowerPoints." What does it say? People who know what they're talking about don't need PowerPoint. Obviously, you need PowerPoint because we need to convey data, but you can kind of apply that. Don't put too much information up there where all they're doing is reading the information and they're not listening to you. Put enough information up there that tells them, oh, here's like a title plus a lead. The lead gives them a little like snippet or a summary. They know exactly what to expect. And then you go beyond that and talk a little bit more about it, right? So it's a fine balancing act, and I don't think I could tell you whether Deloitte likes it this way or McKinsey likes it that way. They all have their own styles. But yeah, it comes down to the style that you chose and make it consistent throughout the deck. Yeah. Depends. So most people don't have that much time to spend on style because you're crunching numbers right up to like the last minute, and then you're doing an all-nighter to put the deck together. That seems to be the case from most consultants I've talked to. Now, some are a little bit better. They organize their work a little bit better, and they spend more time looking at the style and making sure it flows. So I would say spend most of your time doing the pyramid concept, drawing out your storyboard, making sure you have a coherent story, thinking about those lead titles, the horizontal integration of the logic versus the vertical. And then once you've got all of that, you have your slide ready, you spend time making sure things line up, making sure you're conveying message. So I would say that's the last thing you do, because without a story, your idea doesn't really matter. No one's gonna buy into your idea, or at least story might be not applied in every situation. Sometimes you just have a huge data dump that you want to present, and you can't really draw a story out of that. That's fine, but I'm just saying the meat of the presentation should be the idea that you want to convey, and then you use style to really bring it home. And honestly, I've seen people like be super meticulous about style because they've got the slide deck all ready, and then they'll just sit there lining everything up, making sure every line, every font, everything is just perfect. And that seems to really enhance the presentation. And I believe it. I think it does. Hope that answers the question. If you have time, definitely. Yeah. So one tip I have is I don't buy into the dark versus white background. That's, again, it's a personal style. I tend to like the dark backgrounds. But that's, again, I've heard people that don't like it. They're just like, stick to white. But one thing's for sure, never switch from dark to light. That just makes people go crazy. Their eyes needs to adjust all of a sudden. So never do that sort of thing, especially it'll be like almost like a flash of light, and like that's just a big no-no. But when it comes to style and design, keeping it simple goes a long way. So if you choose a dark background and you have simple, beautiful slides, I don't think anyone's gonna care. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I thought that was really interesting, not only in this type of setting, but applying it to my academic setting.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it was possible, or your plan on sharing this slide with the user content so people also to benefit greatly from having that kind of information.
What do you think?
Putting it out.
So I've been told no. You can ask our president, but I'm guessing a lot of this information, to be honest, is available on the internet. So the Mintos pyramid principle, there's more information out there than what I've presented, and they are fantastic. Like, you can look them up, and it'll be probably more eye-opening than what I just presented. This is just a little snippet of it. And going back to the academic world, because I'm from an academic background, it's really good to know these little skills, because I find in the academic world, we don't apply it as much as we should. And a lot of times, great presentations end up being not so good, or great ideas end up being not so good presentations. So yeah, I think it's really beneficial to take these business type styles and applying it to the academic setting. But yeah, if you have any questions about the slides, I'm more than happy to talk to you afterwards, or we can go over stuff a little bit more. Sorry. Sorry? I don't know off the top of my head, but YouTube has a ton of information. So that's a great place to start. Honestly, if you put in Minto's pyramid principle, you'll get so many hits, and you might even get some of the slides that I took from the internet. But like, it is a style that's consistently used by consultants, and that's why they kind of swear by it. So you give it their recommendation heads up. But it also comes down to doing what you guys are doing, making sure you go to case competitions, you get exposure that way. Like, presenting is not easy. It's a scary thing to do, but if you do more and more of it, if you put yourself out there, you'll just master it. Good luck on your case competition next week. Hopefully you use some of these